Now, I mentioned last week, one of the things I wanted to, well, a couple of the things that I wanted to talk about this week were a little bit more about the um, self and other critique, self and peer critiques. And I also wanted to talk quite a bit more about the color and texture tiles that I just briefly talked about last week. And again, I am really sorry about the confusion that I caused, because what I was trying to express was keep the things that we're working on, because after we do the next couple modules, we will return to this sculpture and readdress it with the principles that we've learned with the other modules that we've worked on. That is an important thing to talk about, because about once a semester, I will have a student whose well-meaning family has decided to clean up their messy workstation and throw stuff away, which that has happened to me at different points. And it is so absolutely infuriating, because as an artist, your brain is going in 35 million different directions, and you kind of have to have an area that's a little bit messy, because you're constantly thinking about it and you've got to return to it. So if you need to put up police tape or whatever, lit barricades or traffic cones, whatever you need to, um, go for it.
Or my toddler always wants to touch. I have a 2-year-old and she always wants to touch what I'm working on, so I have to like put it up pretty high to keep her away from it.
Well, and my daughters, when I was going through grad school, would always grab their own paint sets and stuff and come over and help me with whatever project I was working on. And at first, it was really infuriating. And then I realized that they just wanted to help. And so I set up another thing that did a little bit of working on. And by this time, the kids were kindergarten or so, right around there. And I set up a little thing that I would start painting on and then say, hey, could you work on this while I'm working on this other thing? And that seemed to slightly more than half the time, that seemed to help. It never seemed to help when there were 4 hours before I had to turn it in. But, the rest of the time, that seemed to help direct their focus. I can pretty much guarantee it will not work for anybody else's kids, but that was the thing that helped me sometimes. Okay. I want to share this thing and talk about it again. Everybody's responsible for doing two critiques, a critique of their own work and then a critique of a piece of work from one of their peers. And I recommend going to this link right here, describing what you see, Henry Moore, the reclining figure, because there's two art historians that apply these 4 steps to a sculpture that they see. And what's really interesting about this sculpture is that when I first saw it ages ago, it made me want to throw up. I really despised it. And what is fascinating to me is that as we apply the tools of artistic critique in an intention filled manner, whether or not we end up liking the thing, because really that's not the point, we do almost always gain, at the very least, in addition to our own perspective, and ideally, appreciation and respect for the work that went into it, whatever it is. So there's this one at your own critique, or critique my own work, and then there's also critique somebody else's. And I mentioned last week that this is one of the reasons why every work is posted on discussion board, but you don't always have to comment on everything. It's because we use the discussion boards to find something to critique on for somebody else's work. And I'm going to talk specifically about critiquing our own work. And then I'll talk a little bit about critiquing somebody else's. First off, when you set this up for either critique, I think one of the easiest ways to do this is a Teams call where you're the only person in the meeting, and then do a screen share where you're sharing a full screen image of whatever the object is that you're critiquing. That way you don't have to appear on it. And if for whoever has severe social anxiety, which my family is no stranger to, it is perfectly fine to write your critique out and then have somebody else read it and record their voice reading it. The reason I say that is again, once a semester, I will have somebody who will have somebody else read their critique that they wrote for that piece. And it always works out really well. It is a little jarring. It is kind of funny when I know that the person doing the critique is a 19-year-old young lady, and her retired biker father, smoked 3 packs a day since he was 7, is the one who's doing the reading. Hi, I'm Linda. I'm critiquing this work. That's a little funny, but it's going to work just fine, whatever way you want to do it. I've also had people going to get that to work, so they would pull up the slide on their computer, set up their phone with one of those mini tripods, and record a short video where the phone is focused on the artwork and records their voice. That works out really well too. Whatever you need to do to get it to work is just fine. The file, when it comes to me, it needs to be in an MP4 or MOV file. Otherwise, I can't upload it into YouTube. There are some interesting files out there, file formats out there that people have somehow managed to use. The oddest one is a cell phone only file that was really popular in Japan about 3 years ago. I could not find any software that would convert that, so they just had to convert it themselves. But what you'll need to do is 2 separate files. Again, one file focusing on an image of your own artwork, and a second file that focuses on an image of somebody else's work. And the 4 steps to this artistic critique just need to be followed. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to print out that page that has those 4 steps and just go through and ask the questions of yourself, and in your verbal critique, answer the questions out loud. Like, for example, in the description, some of the questions might be, what is the color? What is the style? What is the size? And what's the obvious, or what do you believe are the materials? And instead of asking those questions out loud, you would just say, this appears to be this size. It appears to be made out of these materials, and these are the colors. And then just go through the rest of the critique. The 4 steps, again, are, the first is describe, and that is where we're talking specifically about our observations on the physical presence of the piece. The second one is analyze, and that is where we're talking about specifically our extrapolations of perhaps how the piece was made. This looks like it was carved with a hasp. This looks like it was rounded really carefully with sandpaper. This looks like it was glued with a lot of hot glue, different things like that. Third step is interpreting. And this is where we're guessing pretty much what the person was thinking. What was the intent of the piece? What were they thinking? What's their worldview? Is it a happy piece? Is it a sad piece from potentially their perspective? Excuse me. And then the last step is evaluation, where we're making a judgment call as to whether or not the piece is effective and if it's successful, if we like it. One thing that you'll notice with each of these 4 steps in succession is that the first one, we are trying to be as objective as possible, having as little of our own perspective in the pieces as we can. And with each successive step, we're adding more and more of our own imagination and our own perspective, beginning with the analysis when we're trying to guess from our own experience how the person did the things that they did. And then finally, at the last step, it is almost entirely our own perspective. But what makes us different about it being just an opinion is that throughout we're trying to use the words that we have as artists that allow us to be precise in communicating our observations. So instead of it's pretty, we would say the forms that this person uses are combined in such a way and in a really solid balance so it feels attractive. Now we say that with those words, we've said the same thing as is encompassed by the one word pretty, but by saying it in that way, we actually have some meat to it. And there's something that we can talk about, something that we can point to and say, this specifically is one of the elements that allows me to gauge this as being attractive. You know, instead of saying it's pretty, we've said something that has some substance to it. And that's true for using our precise language in each of those 4 steps. One of the reasons why this is important for a lot of different things, and this is going to be very different than what most people are used to when they do their critique. Most of the time, and Whitley, I would appreciate sharing your own experience about this, but most of the time when we hear the word critique, we're doing class critiques, that's the day that spontaneously I will decide that I'm going to feel sick and I don't want to show up. I don't want to be there to have people tell me how I screwed up, particularly with the audacity that they have no idea what I'm doing in the first place. How can they tell me where I screwed up? Is that how you generally feel when somebody says, "Oh, we're doing critiques"?
Um, Not really. So I just finished my intro to digital imaging class. And so we had to do critiques for every assignment. At first, I didn't want to say anything because I was afraid people were gonna hurt. Like, I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying something, like, even if it was like, oh, I'd be interested to see this in black and white, or because I didn't want anyone to take it as a criticism. And I think that was kind of like I was worried they were gonna criticize my work because maybe they didn't understand like the look I was going for, or they wouldn't understand like my purpose behind it. And no one ever really hurt my feelings because like the more we did the assignments, the more I was like I found myself craving the feedback when I didn't get it. Because I don't know if more people were shy, but I was almost like, wait, I want these to be good. Like I don't want it to just be okay. So I wanted that feedback once I realized like nobody was doing it to be malicious or anything, like, because that was never my intention. It was just, hey, try looking at it this way, because I think that's how we all can kind of grow as artists and become better by like looking at something from a different perspective or trying a new technique or something like that.
I really appreciate that perspective because it sounds like your instructor very carefully created an atmosphere so everybody feels like they're collaborators. And that's ideal. That's perfect. Because real art is never going to be jealous. You know, you don't have the restrictive mentality of a lot of uh, business type ventures in that, well, if I succeed, somebody else has to fail. Art is not like that at all. It's, you know, it's like compassion, which is not a well that will ever run dry. You know, the more you express it, the more you have to draw from. And so there's no reason to feel from anybody's perspective, there's no reason to feel that I've got to drag somebody else down so that there could be more positive energy left so that my stuff looks better. You know, that sounds really funny, but I've worked with committees of people that are very much like that. For one person to
Hmm.
feel like succeeded, everybody else has to be diminished somewhat. And a lot of the times
Well,
people equate, what's that?
Oh, I was just gonna say I've noticed like I found myself like trying to like even if I didn't like something necessarily, I found myself looking for something positive to say because I knew that it didn't need to be negative, and I don't know if that's like a better way to approach it. Like I just really tried to like find something good to say because I mean, a part of it was that I didn't feel qualified to be critiquing someone else's work either. Like I was new to this, so I really tried to like learn like different lingo to like find something positive, and I think that helped too because then it wasn't like, oh, your pictures are really bad or whatever. Like I know that's not a critique, but like I found myself looking for something to be like, oh, you did this really well. I would love to see this. Like it was like a softer way to say like, I loved the angles you used. I would love to see it from a lower perspective because then it wasn't as harsh as like, oh, you didn't do this great, so try it this way. It was just a gentle way of nudging into a different direction, I guess. I don't know if that makes
Well,
sense.
and I really appreciate that. That does make sense. A lot of the times when the knee-jerk reaction is to resist the critique because we think somebody wants or has the audacity to um, tell us how it can be better. And critique does not mean to tear down. It doesn't mean, critical is always a negative word, almost always a negative word. It doesn't mean to point out faults or anything like that. Critical has its roots in the words that have share meaning with intentional and thoughtful and considerate. When we are doing critical thinking, we are doing intentional thinking. We're doing thinking where we're thinking on purpose. And so, in this class, a critique is not going to be any of us telling anybody else how to do something better. Because, first off, like you said just a second ago, how do they know what I'm thinking? We don't. At the very Heidegger, the kindest and gentlest of the Nazi philosophers, pointed out that every time we use a word, we put a brick wall between our communication and every other word. We've picked one word out of a million to use, and now we can't say anything else outside of that, which I think is an interesting way of looking at communication, because in a very real sense, once we've started trying to say what we have to say, we're really limiting all the other possibilities of what we could be saying, which is something interesting to keep in mind. When we start trying to guess at what other people are thinking or trying to open ourselves up to hear what other people have to say about our work and how they can improve it, or the reality is, even though they're trying to help, since they don't know what we're thinking, they really aren't helping. However, when we listen to them, it helps give us ourselves better ideas how to express what's already inside of our minds a lot of the times. And I think that with what your instructor has done in creating an environment of collaboration is really solid, because everybody wants to succeed. And if we appreciate the fact that other people are using their words specifically with the intent and on purpose to help us to find ways to be better, then it loses a lot of that sting that critical or critique a lot of the times has behind it. The main purpose of a critique in this class is not to share with other people how we think they can improve. The main intent is, because we're using the word critical to mean intent and on purpose, when we do an artistic critique, what we are doing is cataloging our thoughts, using our precise language, and sharing for other people how we are interacting with the piece ourselves. And that's it. And we may, at the very end, when we talk about evaluating, we may give our opinion about how this may be more successful, which by the time we get to that, since we've already put in place the language and our own perspective on how we are thinking that the artist might be thinking, then that's perfectly perfectly appropriate, because we are not telling the artist how to improve their own work. What we are doing is sharing with the artist, this is my perspective. And if everything is consistent with my perspective, then I can see that it might be more successful doing these things. But
I
again,
feel like, oh,
I
sorry.
was going to say, again, that is not the intent of our artist critique. Our artist critique is primarily and almost entirely to share with precise language our own interaction with the object that we're examining. Okay, I'm sorry. That I couldn't let you interrupt me because my thought was right on the edge of disappearing forever.
No, you're fine. I know how that goes. I was just gonna say, I feel like critiquing in between finished pieces can be helpful because, like, I don't feel like like my sculpture when you were like trying to soften out the edges, like that was very helpful for me. Like as a critique went because I really got it a lot smoother, and even my husband made the comment like, "Oh my gosh, that looks so much better." Like, but I didn't take it as a negative. It was just I'm learning. Like I took it as a positive, that I like you were trying to teach me, and I feel like in between works can be helpful. Like telling someone like, hey, maybe try this because I didn't know that you could get styrofoam that smooth, honestly. Like I didn't know that it was even possible. So I was just gonna say like the in between viewing of pieces might be helpful just so that we can continue to learn and understand the techniques a little bit more for final, like we're doing all these little techniques working towards a final goal with like the bigger project.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that because we're talking about two specifically different things. The artist critique that you guys are doing is just sharing your own perspective on a finished piece. And one thing that I was really appreciating about people turning things in a little bit early is I can talk about them and do exactly what you were saying, and that helps me to share my perspective on the instruction elements more. So I think that is really valuable. If while you're working on pieces, if you want another opinion from somebody, that is really valuable to have. When you tell you, for example, your husband, this is going in a direction that I want, but I'm just missing something. And he may say, well, what are you trying to do? And you'll express that, and then he'll probably put his hand on his chin and then really describe the things that he specifically sees as perhaps not fitting entirely with his perspective on what you've just told him. And I think when you're talking about it from that perspective, it's no longer a frightening thing. It's no longer a negative thing at all. What I really like about what you're saying is it becomes an additional tool to help us to better express the intent that we've begun with, when we are building that piece of art. So I think that that's wonderful. For this assignment, I wanted to give a short demonstration over a piece of art, just so that I can show kind of how this is a little bit different, when we're looking at a specifically finished piece and applying these four steps or four tools. I'm going to look up this is just the first artist that came to my mind. And I wanted to show one of the images of one of their works and just do a critique on it. So let's see if we can do this. Can I do view image? All right, and I'm going to share my screen now so you see the image that I'm seeing. That is always more helpful. All right. Now, this is the piece of artwork that I'm going to critique, and I'm going to do it for about 3 minutes, hopefully, and just share with you what the steps are. Now, can you see the little mouse on this?
Or yes, I can.
Okay. All right, good. All right, this is a piece by Andy Goldsworthy, and I do not know what the title is. Sometimes he titles them, sometimes he doesn't. I'm not familiar with the title on this. The first step of the critique is to describe. What it looks like to me is that this is an installation on the bank of a stream. It appears to be a stream. Looking at the ripples in the water, the scale, I would say, would make it so that this is probably 14 to 18 inches across, maybe. That's what I'm guessing. The water seems to be in a very calm area of the stream, just downstream from, it looks like up here on the right, upper right, is a little bit of a runnel of water, so it looks like this is downstream and that's upstream. There's a lot of very smooth river rocks around this. The art piece itself looks like it's these circular twigs designed to interact with the rocks right here. So again, it looks like this is anywhere from 14 to 18 inches across. Each of these twigs are rather round, and they're curved as well. And it looks like each of them are maybe 3/16 of an inch in diameter at the most, with many of them being 6 to 14 inches long and curved like this. They look like reeds rather than sticks, to be honest. I also see little areas of moss. It feels to me as if these stones are intended to be worked as little as possible. So it feels like almost they were there spontaneously and the artist just came with the sticks. That's what it seems to me. But it feels to me very much so that the placement, the setting, is just as important to the object as the object itself, the object being these reeds in a circle around the center stone. Okay, so in that, I've addressed questions of size, I've addressed questions of material and placement a little bit, and I'm specifically just talking about the things that I see. Now, when we go to analyze, it's going to, hopefully you'll hear a little bit of a shift in the intent. So looking at how this is made, at first glance, it looks like the rocks might be set on top of all of these reeds or circular twigs. I don't know, it feels to me that perhaps these were made wet and stored somewhere, just like basket reeds are, so that they would retain the circular form. But like I said, at our first glance, you'd think, oh, well, the stones are set down. This looks very much like the stone was set down on top of the circular reeds. But then I look over here, this reed is set on top of the stone. These reeds right here are broken off right touching this where they touch the stone. And then it looks like they are broken again and placed against this stone on the other side to curve around. And then these are put on top to kind of hold them in place. We see the same kind of thing happening again, where it looks like they're broken on one side, broken on the other side, so that it appears that the reeds are passing through the stones. And I see that in some places. It looks like this stone is set on top, and I'm assuming to hold the reeds in place, because I see that on the other side too. And then over here, I see here's some stones where some of them are placed on the reeds, and then right here I see very specifically these two reeds look like they're broken because they end right at the edge of that rock. Here, this one looks like it's broken because it ends right at the edge of the rock, and then it comes up a little bit here. But it looks like this is very carefully crafted so that it looks like many of the reeds are passing through the stone, and that rhythm is established so when other stones are set on top, it doesn't really bother us. It doesn't feel like there's there just to hold the reeds down. And it looks like the reeds have been curved in slightly tighter diameters so that the tightest one goes right around the central stone, and the widest diameter ones are on the outside edge. And it looks like some of these are very carefully placed so that like this reed doesn't ever touch the water, it just gets really close. And then this reed comes around and gets really close to the water, but again, the end is right against this rock. So it looks like it's just very carefully done so that this is all very parallel to the surface of the water without quite touching it. All right, so how did that second step vary from the first step of description? What was I doing slightly differently?
It feels like it was a little bit more in depth than what sorry, I'm trying to pull up steps so I can, like, in the first step describing, like, you were describing what you saw, and then the second step for analyzing, like, it was more in depth, like you talked more about the rings going over and under, or the reeds, is that what those are? More over and under, more about like the placement of things, where describing it was like, oh, it's some rocks and it's a stream, and it just seemed more of
Yeah,
like an in-depth.
it's a little bit closer observation, and I'm trying to extrapolate how the artist actually went about making it. And
Okay.
that's, and that's, so it's a little bit more of my imagination in it. So definitely, yeah, you're right. Now, the third step is um, interpret. Now, I know who this artist is. His name is Andy Goldsworthy. He does an awful lot of stuff where he engages with the environment, specifically building things that are meant to be impermanent. They're meant to fall apart within hours, sometimes days, sometimes maybe years, but they're intended to fall apart. And he tries very hard not to bring anything extra with him to use. So he won't, for example, make marks on the stones unless he's making marks with other items that he sees, right there in the area. So he's trying to use everything very specific to the area. Now, knowing all that and looking at these reeds, what I'm going to be guessing is my thought behind this, the intent of this is to make us think about things like, considering also that this is right next to a stream with lots of little eddies and stuff. Maybe this is a good time to think about ideas of cycles. How does the water flow? The ripples in water, how does that engage in other elements? Because with these expanding rings of reeds, it mirrors very much like what you would see in a relatively still pool with the water around a small island rock, perhaps, or a rock that was just thrown in. You have these concentric rings coming out. And I think this is also an engagement on ideas about interactions with nature, not necessarily anything negative or harsh about man's interaction with nature or humankind's interaction with nature, but just the fact that things interact in nature. A stone making a ripple does not need a person to throw it. Sometimes they're knocked over by uh, um, natural effects. Sometimes they're knocked over by other animals. But it is interesting that there is this reflection, perhaps, on a very energetic ecosystem and an energetic interrelation of different elements of energy. So, with that, what did I do that was a little bit different than the analyze?
I couldn't find my thing. I feel like it was more trying to guess the intent behind his work, or maybe guess isn't the right word. just kind of figure out the meaning behind his work, or what the intent behind, or what he wanted it to symbolize, or
Yeah, and
what
it's
you are getting, like what it symbolizes to you and what you're gaining from it.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And I guess is a good word, but since we're at the university, we've got to come up with other synonyms to make us sound more educated. So that's why we'll use words like extrapolate. We're essentially guessing, but the more syllables, the more educated you are, you know. And you know how that is. But yeah, you're exactly right. We are guessing at the intent of the artist. But I think we have, with our close observation and using precise language, we can pretty much justify pretty well our guesses. If I'm saying this has to do with cycles of nature and concentric rings of energy in the surface of the water, I can point to specific elements of this piece to validate or justify that observation or that guess. So yeah, you're precisely right. That's what we're doing. And at no point am I trying to say I speak for Andy Goldsworthy. What I am trying to express is this is what I'm getting out as a careful observer. This is what I think as a careful observer. So I'm trying to hold almost a conversation with the artist, whereas I'm not talking to the actual artist. I'm talking to an avatar, an imaginary avatar of the artist that I've created as I'm examining this work. Now, the last one is evaluate. This is the fourth step. And with this step, I want to see if this thing is successful. Now, the word successful is rather arbitrary most of the time, but what we're looking for to establish whether or not something is successful is, does the artist demonstrate enough respect for us as a viewer to use their skills of craftsmanship, properly, to make us feel as a viewer that they respect us enough that they've completed the work and it feels like the work is completed? Is the artist consistent enough in their workmanship that it feels like they uh, shared value in creating this piece for us? So the value is not necessarily pennies and dollars. The value is, are we getting something out of it? Or did the artist get something out of it and we're just along for the ride? Ideally, it's going to be both. So evaluating this, I'm looking at this, it is very evident to me that the artist was very careful, believing that knowing that these are all elements that were found on site, the artist had to very carefully bend these reeds or twigs so that they were very precise in the circumferences that they demonstrate. And that the twigs wrapped very tightly around that central rock, and then that circumference expanding as the twigs go out to the outside edge of the ring. It feels very consistent. It does not, the space between everything is not identical, and you can't follow a single line all the way through. That doesn't feel to be the intent, but the artist took enough care with the twigs that he uses that it feels to me that, for example, like right here, we have a gap, and over here in the same area, the gap is not the same, is rather tightly packed. It feels to me that with the consistency of craftsmanship that the artist was using, this was intentional. It wasn't intended to be lazy. Right here, we have this open space, and I read that more as a stick going down into the water and coming back out than him being lazy and not making the full ring. So, little clues like that from close observation, I will say that the craftsmanship was consistent, and it was very thoughtful, very considerate. It's evident that the artist shows respect towards me as a viewer in providing a finished object, and something is communicated. Something is very strongly communicated. I interpret that communication to be, this is a meditation on observations about water, about energy, about ecosystem, things working together, different energies coming together. And whatever the artist's actual intent is, I believe that it's, you know, he's successfully communicating to me and respecting me as an intelligent viewer. So I think this piece is successful. What differentiates that last step, that fourth step? I'm gonna go ahead and stop the sharing, so we'll just talk about it. What differentiates that fourth step of evaluation from the other three? And how does it grow out of the third one?
I feel like it was more an evaluation of the intent behind it, not necessarily like the technique, where like describing and analyzing seemed more like technique, but interpreting and evaluation seemed more like you were wanting to know the intent behind his work, and by evaluating how it was done, like whether or not that got his message across.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, you know, until all of us have equal shares of telepathy, it's going to be impossible to know somebody's true intent, full intent, rather. But do you think that with careful observation and thinking about this the way, you know, with intent like we were doing, do you think we can get a pretty good handle on perhaps what they're thinking?
I think so. I also feel like art is meant to be shared. So like by explaining your critique, like I might get something completely different out of it. And I think that's kind of the intent behind most
Yeah,
pieces of work, because I saw it more as the rings being like a ripple effect, just more of a permanent version. Like when you drop a rock into the stream, like you have the little
right.
waves and then they go away, but like the reeds made it more of a permanent, like, hey, this center choice was made and it's a more firm thing. But I feel like that's like the beneficial piece of art, is that you see it one way, I see it one way, we discuss it, and then we both can get like a different perspective on maybe what the intent was.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. This idea of the artist critique is not at all graded on whether or not you guess the person's intent correctly. That has nothing to do with it. Art is, I think, more than most other things, an environment for intelligent conversation. You know, when more than one person looks at something, you're going to have more than one perspective. A friend of mine says you put two artists in a room and you're going to get three opinions at least, and that's true. I mean, we are not trying to find the right or wrong answer for something. What we're doing is articulating our own perspective, which gives us value in having a conversation. You know, and it begins with an imaginary conversation with that avatar of the artist. But if more than one person are critiquing the same thing and we begin talking about it, it gives us an opportunity to explore something. You know, one of I'm shifting gears just a little bit. The Rorschach tests show you these ink blots, and you articulate what you see in the ink blot. It ends up telling the therapist a lot more about where your thoughts are than what the object is that you're looking at. And that's the same way I think about art. And what is interesting to me, though, is that during this process, your opinion about something can change dramatically. Uh, and it may take years, it may take just a few moments. A lot of the times, if you can record, you know, write down your initial impression, then keep that out of your mind and or keep that away from your mind as much as you can while you go through this process of the four steps. At the end, you will almost always have a different perspective than your initial response. And what's interesting to me is that Henry Moore sculpture that I have in the example, uh, for that video that I want everybody to watch, that Henry Moore sculpture, like I said, the first time I saw it, I wanted to barf. But over the years, applying the tools of artistic critique, I began generating a certain amount of respect for Henry Moore. Then I learned about the environment of the world that he was in when he built that, what kind of tools and materials he used, then what he had to say about it himself, going back and looking at it again and trying to pay attention to what it was for itself and not as just a screen to bounce back my own perceptions, my own bias. Over the years, it gotten to the point where I do not believe my family will be happy with me having a full-size copy of that in the middle of the living room in front of the TV. But personally, I really like it now. I think it's remarkable. I love his stuff. For what he was trying to do and for what I believe he was trying to do, it's absolutely astonishing. And so that's a complete reversal of perspective because of specifically applying these 4 tools of artistic critique. Another thing that I'd like everybody to do as you critique your own work, and this is really important, make sure that when you critique your own work, you pretend that it's the first time you've ever seen it. Try to remove all of your memories and perceptions about it from you as much as you possibly can. Try to be as dispassionate as possible when you describe it. And what happens if you do that almost every time? Actually, it's been every time. Nobody's told me about a single time that this has not happened. Almost every time you gain insights and greater appreciation to your own skills as an artist and to the thing that you're critiquing. There's over the years, there have been people in class critiquing their own work where they start off very objective about it, pulling back as much as possible. And by the end, they realize, holy cow, I really did do a good job on this. I was amazing. And that's, who's going to be your worst critic? I mean, as an artist, it is always yourself. You always are driving to be more precise, more exact, more specific about how you express your intent when you create things. And a lot of times that is expressed to ourselves as criticism, harsh criticism on our own work, when the perspective should be, I did this and I finished it. It was the very best thing I ever have done in my life up to that point. It remains the best thing I've ever done in my life up to that point. And now I'm going to use it to learn from, rather than, oh, I should have done this. I should have done that. I should have done this. And that is something, even though we try really hard not to be nasty to ourselves, as artists, we can't help it a lot of the time. We become embarrassed over what we perceive to be failures. And I hope that when you do this self-critique, it gives you an opportunity to recognize that you do a remarkable job of your own work. And the reality is, however many years you've been doing your own work, when you make a sculpture in this class for the very first time with hot glue and pipe cleaners, it is the very best pipe cleaner and hot glue sculpture you have ever made in your entire life up to that point. And that's the perspective that I want you guys to have. Of course, you'll learn from it. The next one will be better, but you still need to recognize that that was pretty dang good for what it was at that time. So, that's, I'd hoped to only spend a few minutes on that. Spent quite a bit longer than I had intended, but hopefully that was valuable. And I did change the link. So what you will see on those 2 pages is a link to the 4 tools of artistic critique. And there is a video I want everybody to watch at least a couple times about the Henry Moore sculpture and applying the tools of artistic critique to it. Let's see. I did want to go over a couple quizzes really quick, and I'm just going to touch on them very briefly, only a few minutes. And then I want to talk about the texture and color tile. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, this is the quiz for biomorphic abstraction. And a lot of people have done this. For the people who haven't, I wanted to just touch on it. And if you miss any points, you can always go back and retake it. That's not a problem at all. When we talk about form and shape, this is one of the questions I want to address. What is the difference between form and shape in this class in our 3D design?
Want me to answer it, or was it rhetorical?
Oh, it wasn't intended to be rhetorical.
Okay.
What do you think is the difference between, actually, no, I'm not going to put you on the spot. Shape
Okay.
refers to two-dimensional drawing. Like this right here is the shape of a rectangle. This is the shape of a green rainbow. Form is shape expanded out into 3 dimensions. An example would be the shape of a circle expanded into 3 dimensions would be the form of a sphere. The shape of a square expanded into 3 dimensions would be the form of a cube. So that's what the difference is there. Now, scrolling down on these, Whitley, if there are any questions that you would like me to touch on, I will talk about that. Non-objective or non-representational forms do not refer to any object from our 3-dimensional world. We talked about this last week when we were talking about abstraction. What is the difference between regular abstraction and non-objection or non-objective or non-representational? Abstraction generally means simplifying, focusing on shapes or forms outside of context, exploring a simplified version of something. But it's a lot of the times abstract is going to suggest that we're drawing from the observable world. Non-objective or non-representational forms are like when people are making sculptural representations of sounds or emotions, letters, different things like that, that do not have a naturally occurring presence in the real world. So non-objective is going to be dealing with ideas of geometry, dealing with ideas of emotions, non-physical things. So this is the true or false question. Non-objective, non-representational forms do not refer to any object from our 3-dimensional world. That is very true. This monolithic forms do not well. Actually, the rest of this I think is pretty explanatory for most of this. But like I said, Whitley, if there's a question you'd like me to touch on, I will. This is a really good one. Softness of a material does not equate to the ease of working. Now that you guys have had experience shaving and carving your phone, I think all of you will attest to the fact that softness has very little to do with ease of working. This one sometimes people will get wrong too. Representational figurative forms are those that relate directly to the human body. Representational and figurative forms are forms that have relation to things we observe. So this figurative form could be of an actual tree, of an actual dog, of an actual animal or object. There are a number of artists that will do representational work where they will actually reproduce something in a completely different material so that it looks just like the original, or they will change something to scale. Klaus Oleg did this famously with a gigantic fork bridge that he made, where it was representational of a fork and was just at a massive scale. Generally, representational or figurative refers to an organic object, but it could be where we are mimicking anything that already exists in the actual world. So it doesn't have to relate directly to the human body. It could be a representational form, could be a sculpture of a tree instead of a human body. And this talks about living rock, and living rock is when you carve something specifically from something that remains in place. Like when this is famous, the Treasury of Petra, this is carved directly into a stone outcropping. And the moai were actually blocks of lava rock that were mined from mountains and then carved and then walked to the site that they're at. Most of the heads that you see above ground are actually just the top part of sculptures like this, where the rest of the body is buried. So these are separated from the living rock and then made elsewhere. And on this one, there was a little bit of confusion on parts of a couple people. On each of these four dichotomies, static and dynamic, primary and secondary, interior and exterior, it refers to these words in relation to sculpture. And then the one or two sentence explanation is, what is a static form versus dynamic form? And you describe that. So for A, you would say static is an X type form, and dynamic would be a form that exhibits movement, for example. So that's the difference in there. This one, it's interesting to me. I can almost always tell when people answer this after they've been carving the foam and gotten really frustrated, as opposed to when they answered this before. So I think that's a really good. So there are a couple important questions there. If you miss anything, you refer to the text. That is, it rarely goes wrong. Now let's see. No segue again. I'm just going to the texture and light thing. I do want to talk a little bit about this. This page right here, I'm sorry. Let's do a segue. I'm sorry about that. What I've been noticing is that when people take the quiz, almost everybody gets a perfect score on the first try, and that's great. And if they don't, everybody's been redoing them and turning them in specifically with all the other answers the same, changing only the answers that I said were incorrect. There is still, it is important to look at the text because there are a couple ringers in there. For example, the line. What is the simplest definition of a line? It is not the shortest distance between 2 points. The simplest definition of a line is the definition of a line that is in the text, which is different than the math definition. Right now, the thing that everybody should be working on pretty soon here is the texture and color tiles. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this and how important this is. As sculptors, a lot of the times we are thinking specifically about visual texture. We're not thinking a lot about color. We're not thinking about other things. But what's interesting is that sculptors always do. If you look at things like, I'm thinking of the Pieta by Michelangelo, where Mary is holding the very dead Jesus. It's carved out of marble. He was very aware of the ribbons of color in the marble. He was very aware of how light interacted with the surface of the textures he was creating as he was directing the carving of that. And it's interesting to me because so much care was taken into that, and he was so careful about it that it feels completely effortless. Another thing that is really interesting to me, is that a lot of people don't realize that even though during the Renaissance, they talked about the purity of white marble, and this really demonstrates one of the births of the vocabulary that was later used to develop the ideas of racism. But there were a number of Renaissance writers that wrote about how ideal ideal marble had to be as pure and white as possible. And they were making reference, they were trying to tie themselves to the cognitive leaps that occurred during the Roman and Greek times and try to establish authority as thinkers by connecting themselves to what the Greeks and Romans did, because everybody during the Renaissance knew that Greeks and Romans only worked in white marble. Were you aware that all of those objects that we see that were carved in Greek and Roman antiquity were painted to look like living people? This is something that started showing up as during the 90s when people started using spectrum microscopy. I'm sorry, I can't say that word right now. Using spectrum microscopes, they found microscopic flakes of paint in marble sculptures that everybody thought were intended to be white marble. And then some of the interviews that people like Da Vinci did with some of the workmen, as he would do sketches of people as they would sit, just random people sitting down for him. He would do sketches of them, and he would ask them about their jobs, and sometimes he takes notes. But then we start learning that a lot of these workmen, when the wealthy people wanted them to find Greek and Roman sculptures, they would pull them out of the dirt. The paint would be all nasty and bubbly and decayed, and these guys would scrape all the paint off so they would get white marble. And that's where they also found that Severus, the Roman emperor that founded London, he was actually born in, his wife was from Libya. No, I think he was from Libya, and his wife was from Syria. And so Severus was actually a Black African man whose family had become citizens, and he rose to be emperor. So London itself was founded by an African emperor who did not fit that Renaissance ideal of the white-skinned Greek or Roman, which I think is really interesting too. But there's there's a couple of videos to watch talking about that with the colors of original sculptures that I want you to see. Anyway, moving on. As we go to the assignment, I glossed over the quiz and other things. We'll revisit the quiz in just a moment. But the assignment, what I would like you to do, one of the reasons why you have that cardboard box is you will need to use your straight edge and a surface you can cut on, which means do not cut on your lap. You will need to use a straight edge and cut 12 tiles that are all identical squares that are 4 inches by 4 inches. And you're going to separate these 12 tiles into 2 piles of 6. One set of 6 you will be doing textures on, and the other set of 6 you will be making color collages. And for the color part, what we've got here, I have several websites to go to that are color wheels that you can use. And when you go to them, just visit all of them really quick and look and see which one you're happiest with. If you already use one for one of your digital painting classes or something else, that's fine. You can use that. But what we need to do is when we make these color tiles, remember the color collages. You can use old magazines, make sure you have permission, or you buy them from Dollar Tree or something like that. You can use scraps. You can go to stores that sell paint like Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's and borrow some of their design guides and some of their paint chips and you can use those. But you are going to be making collage, which means more than 3 pieces. I would say use 9 to 12 pieces at least for each of these or more. And for these 6 color tiles, you are going to choose 3 different color combinations, types. I'm sorry. What we're talking about is the color combination type would be complementary, triadic. And let's see, I'm going to go to one of these. This one talks about color harmonies. And this is exactly what we want, which is basically color combination types. This is the Sessions College website. And what you are going to do for your tiles is you are going to pick 3 different color combination types, color combination harmony types. This is complementary, for example. This one is analogous, where they're all very similar to each other. This one is a split complementary. This one triadic and tetradic. So that describes where they are, the colors lie on the color wheel. You're going to pick 3 of those and do 2 tiles for each of those 3 color harmonies. So if
Will it be in the same colors?
no, you can pick. I would prefer you do different sets of color for each one.
So like if I picked the triadic, I would do 2 triadics in any color, or would both triadics be the same colors?
Well, okay, so I'm picking triadic, and for the first one, I'm going to pick as one of my colors, I'm going to pick red. And if I'm using the triadic color scheme, oh, this is not working the way it's supposed to. Then this is supposed to automatically.
Do you click on Get Color Scheme? Or
Oh, yeah, I'm thinking you're right. Oh, no, Get Color Scheme takes you to a different portion of it.
oh, okay.
On your site. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to find another one that's I'm more familiar with. That one, the first time I got it, it seemed to work pretty well. Okay, so PixArt, what we can do is, well, let's pick triadic, like you're saying, and I'm going to move principal color right here. So my first color tile using the triadic scheme is going to have this red, this kind of earthy green, and this darker blue to it. And those are going to be the 3 colors that I'm going to be focusing on when I make my 9 to 12 piece collage. Then for my second triadic one, I'm going to pick this purple. And it changes, it makes the green quite a bit more yellow, and it brings the blue a lot more towards aqua. So those are going to be the 3 colors I use for my second triadic color tile. And then say I want to do a monochromatic one. This one I think is pretty obvious. Maybe the first one is going to be lilac like that, but maybe my second one, I'm going to go with kind of a gray green. And that's going to be my 2 monochromatic tiles. And then for my fourth one, I'm going to do analogous. And these are colors that are just really similar to each other. So this is my center color, and these are the analogous shades just to either side of it. So my first one is going to do, green with a little bit of green yellow right up here, and maybe a warmer green. And then for my second analogous color tile, I'm going to do 3 different shades of blue, or a blue. I'm going to have an indigo, a blue, and an aqua. So they're all analogous. Does that make more sense? Okay.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so each of the 6 tiles are going to be different colors. 2 of the 6 tiles are going to be one color scheme. 2 of them are going to be another color scheme, and 2 of them are going to be a third color scheme. And you could do achromatic, monochromatic, analogous, triadic, tetradic, or complementary. You know, there's several different ones. I'm sorry, what was that?
Oh, I was just talking to my child off camera.
Okay. I thought you were asking something with the mic off, but
No, she's just having a hard time, so I was just trying to help her.
okay, good. All right, so that I hope that makes sense. So find one of these. This one, if you can get it to work, that's great. But we have, I'm sorry, the sessions one is good if you can get it to work, but we have 5 different ones to draw from. And go use one, find it. You can also sometimes find this kind of a thing in a paint store. If you do get paint chips from a paint store to use in your collages, please try not to get all that you need at one paint store. Go to several different ones so nobody gets upset. Because technically they're all supposed to be free, but people do have a tendency to get a little irritated if students go in and take all of their paint samples at the same shot. All right, so hopefully that will help with that. So I've also gone to Hobby Lobby, and if you go into like the jewelry making aisle, go down to where the glass mosaic places are, the wax, things like that. They have these free design sheets that are just these single sheet of directions for how to do different things. Sometimes they'll have really cool pictures on them, and I have gone through, taken like half a dozen of those, and then torn that up and used that for the color imagery or the color pieces for my collage. I've done that before, and that can be really kind of interesting too. So don't try really hard. If you can, try really hard not to spend any money on the color for the color collage. Old magazines, make sure they're old and nobody else is going to use them, i.e. do not steal anybody's National Geographic collection. It's a bad idea. Now, going down, so that's 6 tiles. So we've done 6 tiles as color. The other 6 tiles, what we're going to do is work with making textures. And these textures, I want you to do a senses walk, and I describe what that is down here. A senses walk is where you, let's see. Oh, I wonder where I wrote it down, because I wrote it down how to do a senses walk. It's basically where you just go out and experience the things around you as much as you possibly can. And essentially go for a walk, or you can even do this inside of your own apartment or your own home. Go for a walk in a park and just pay really a lot of attention to the colors and textures around you. See if you can find anything interesting. Well, I do not recommend stripping bark off of trees. If you find interesting pieces on the ground that are already dead and separated from trees, that's really interesting. You can collect dirt, little pebbles, find old weeds. Tumbleweeds are sometimes really interesting. You can also go to a Dollar Tree. Sometimes the silk flowers they have really interesting textures to them. Or you can harvest petals and plants that you own, or leaves, different things like that. And take them, get them for their textures, because these next 6 tiles, you are going to be creating your own texture. And you can use cardboard, like right here, the person has used cardboard from their kit, where you can tell that they separated it so you can see the corrugation. They've used different parts from different boxes so you get slightly different colors. And the textures that you see here are generated in a couple ways. One, stripping off one layer of the cardboard so you see what's underneath. Another way is tearing away some parts and just exploring that area that's torn. Some of these are cut in specific shapes, cut in specific sizes, and the overlapping of shapes and sizes are what gives it a kind of an interesting visual texture. In this one, the person took, I kind of like this one because the person has apparently OCD. They cut really teeny strips, and overlaid them. So it almost looks like you're standing or you're floating in the sky above some sort of wild power plant or something with all sorts of pipes going here and there everywhere. This person developed textures by making shapes where they glued the edges of the cardboard together. And the texture is developed by how the different shapes reflect the light. That's really interesting. These are really fascinating. This one person made their one of their textures by cutting away elements on the front surface of the cardboard and leaving the corrugation underneath. So you get this fascinating interplay of light against the corrugation. This person made textures in a number of different ways. These are all based on cardboard. They used strips that they put together very tightly. They used strips in this case and piled them almost like twigs. And here they coiled them up. And in this particular one, the coils are stacked on top of each other. And on here, the coils are put on end and stood next to each other. Here, the person took the corrugation out of the center of the cardboard and made an interesting basket weaving type of texture with it. So this person did a lot of different things. And then here we get examples that people have done with these texture tiles for class. So on this one, you can see that the person collected a lot of flowers, a lot of dried weeds, and some grass. And so these three sides are made up with those things that they carefully collected and then glued on. So you don't see the glue, you just see the texture of the plant material. And here, there's some leaves. This is from, it looks like a juniper, maybe. And then this is from some other weeds. And again, they're very carefully applying them to the tile so that you get this very interesting texture generated. With leaves, sometimes it's cool to split them down the center and to glue that center in so that the leaf part sticks out at right angles to the surface of the tile. That can be really interesting too. Now these, I think that this was a successful collage. Only 3 different colors. This was a successful collage. Perhaps not as much because it doesn't have very many different pieces. Perhaps not as much because it doesn't have very many pieces. But the smaller pieces you get in your collage, the more precise you can be in your application of color. This one I think is really interesting because in the texture one, even though you can see that there's some plant material here they tore up cardboard. In this case, the person wanted to emphasize the quality of the texture over the color of the texture, so they spray painted their box or their tiles white, and that can be very interesting. And on this one, the person used photographs that kind of explored the color themes that they were working with, which I think is really interesting. Here, I like this collage and this collage. This one is only 3 pieces of felt, so doesn't work as well. But here, you can see that they made the texture and then spray painted the whole thing in solid color, which I think is really fascinating. And here's another one that I think belongs to the same person that did this, where they spray painted their texture tiles all the same color. I think that's fascinating. Here, the person glued the materials that they collected on. Now you don't, like I said, you don't have to glue natural materials on. You don't have to use them for all your textures. If you have a collection of beads or buttons that you want to get rid of, you can put that on. If you are going to use buttons, make the button a valuable texture. Don't just put 6 buttons on there and call it good. By that I mean, by making a valuable texture, I mean take 40 or 50 buttons, glue them down so they completely cover the side, the face of one of your tiles. Then glue another layer on so you can see some of the previous buttons through that layer, and then glue another layer on. And you can use your hot glue or Elmer's or Gorilla Glue or whatever. Or maybe to make your button texture, you glue the buttons on edge so they come out straight at right angles to the surface of the tile. This I think they could have done. I think this is an interesting start, but here it would have been fascinating to make a woven texture with this grass so that all the cardboard is covered. Same kind of thing right here. putting a lot more leaves on. So it's not just a botany sample. This needs to be a texture. It's not designed to be a display for the leaves that you collected. And I like how these two collage sides are really nice. I think that that's successful. And right here, I think this one is really successful. Here we see textures where they actually put rocks on. I'd be kind of careful with the rocks because that is going to put a strain on the structural integrity of your cube when you're finished making it. But one thing you will notice about these is that each submission has two photos. And each photo has the texture cube so we can see three faces, and the color cube so we can see three faces. And then the other one, the second photo in the series, shows the other three faces of the texture and the other three faces of the color. That way, in two photos, you can show all of the textures and colors that you've made. Hopefully, this is making a little bit more sense as you see this example. This is complementary. It's not a very good collage. And this is, well, what would we call that? I think that this is probably more monochromatic, where it's shades of the red. Then this almost feels analogous, where it feels like it's a reddish or rust and an amber that are on both sides of this brown. So seeing those examples, Whitley, does that make a lot of sense as to what this is?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it does.
Okay, good. What I would suggest is when you do this, more is always going to be better. When you do your texture and you think you're done, look at it and spend more time on it. These should each take you between half an hour and 45 minutes. If they take you 3 minutes, you're not doing it right. So, put some thought into it and put some experimentation into it. I really like the one mosaic where the person took and cut little triangles of the color samples from the paint store and then put that on. I thought that was really nice because it allowed the person to direct and control the flow of color a little bit easier. And I think that turned out really well. Now, we are almost out of time, so I wanted to go over let's see. I wanted to go over the quiz for this module really quick. And we're just going to zoom through it. If you have any questions specifically, that's great. We'll stop and we'll talk about it directly. Now, this first one lists 12 words that are adjectives that can be used to describe texture. The easiest way to do this is to do this with your family or friends, a group of people, and just say, hey, my class needs to have a list of words that we can use to describe texture. Could you guys help me? The first 3 or 4 are going to be difficult, but after that, when people realize it's okay to be silly as you're talking about these, very quickly you're going to get a list of about 30 or 40. We would do this in class with everybody. The first couple would be hard, and then we would just start going through the alphabet, list all the ones we could think of for each letter, and about 5 minutes into it, it started becoming a lot easier. So some textures may be slippery. Slimy is a good one. Snotty. My dad would always say slick as snot on a doorknob. So slick is a texture. Slithery. Scaly. Those are for S. Maybe if we're talking about other textures, we can think about hairy. That here it says hard on this one. Horny. That leads me to think about prickly, spiny, leathery, like skin on a lizardy. That really disgusting, soggy moss that you find at the end of or next to a pond. It's maybe like algae.
Spongy.
That slimy algae. Yeah, what's that?
Spongy.
Spongy. Yeah, that's a good one. Those are all good. But I would recommend just getting a list of about 20, from a group of people, and then you can go down and write down 12 of them. Just make sure you don't use any of those 6 in your list of 12. And most of these, like I said, all the answers are going to be in the textbook. And in this, the chapters are 7, 8, and 14 to go through. I hope nobody's had a hard time accessing the textbook. From what I've read from everybody's been able to get a hold of the textbook really easily. So that is that's terrific. We talked about artificial lighting as an artist. I think that this really depends on what the artist's intent is. For most of us, we want to have our art displayed in a gallery with the best lighting, and we want that lighting to be consistent. I think that's pretty true because we want it to be in the best light possible. But if you are like Andy Goldsworthy, and you want it to feel like it's part of the landscape, that's going to change. But for most cases, I think artificial lighting is lighting that you can control, and it makes it a lot more desirable as an artist. Casting is not a simple process at all. So as you go through, if you have any questions, let me know. But this is all covered in those 3 chapters, 7, 8, and 14. Now I really like this one. James Turrell and Dan Flavin, that's what these 2 objects are. This is James Turrell built this room inside of a mountain. And then Dan Flavin will make these installations that are architectural. They're pretty solid installations. And as you look at these 2 things, the colors are identical. They're using the same color palette, using the same, you have a person in each one. But I want you to reflect a little bit on what are some of the things that make these 2 very different. We talk about line quality, talk about the kind of color. Is it harsh? Is it mellow? And the kind of light source. Is it natural? Is it artificial? And how that affects it. So you're going to be just sharing a little bit on your perspective of how these 2 artists use light as a medium and use it differently. Oh, and this is an example of what I mentioned earlier of figural work. Both of these things look very, very realistic, but they're not. This is ceramic, and this is polymer clay right here. And I just think that's absolutely amazing. Now there's a couple different terms. One is French and one is English, but they both mean the same thing. And that's in one of your chapters too. And if you misspell it and the computer doesn't recognize it, you'll get it dinged wrong. But when I go through and correct, I always change that, give you the points, because the computer can't tell what the word is supposed to be. And here we talk about design and design on the surface of an object and how it is linked to culture and historical definitions of beauty. I think that is an important thing to talk about. After you do this, next week we can talk more about this. But it is interesting that just as people assume that what they are used to is the way the world always has been, people assume that there are ways that we look at what is satisfying or attractive and think that's the way it always is. And that's really not. Beauty is a little bit separate of a thing than the cultural definitions of beauty, I think. Because beauty deals with ideas. And when we start talking about beautiful objects, a lot of the ways that we interpret that beauty is through the context of the culture that we are part of. And there's some interesting conversations there. One thing that I'm going to preach for just a little bit and share, it's my opinion, but I think it can be validated by what we see in history. One of the things that bothers me is sometimes when people will talk about art, they will say, well, this culture just wasn't mature enough, or aware enough or smart enough to know how to do this properly. And I always, even if I'm not showing it properly in this context, is very definitely in air quotes. The problem with that assumption is that the person is assuming that everybody since the dawn of time has had the same sense of aesthetics that the individual speaking has. That is simply not true. Aesthetics are a reflection of what is important, what is valuable in the culture that is present, as well as what materials are available to the culture in that present. So when you talk about a beautifully designed and built building in Ethiopia, for example, it is going to look very specifically different than a very beautifully architecturally sound, wonderfully designed building done in Dwarka, for example, ancient India. And that is going to look very, very different from a beautifully designed, perfectly, ideally constructed building in the Yucatan. You know, we're talking about three very different areas of the world. A person living in Ethiopia, growing up with the buildings that they're surrounded with all the time, if they wake up one morning and find themselves in the Yucatan looking at Mayan temples, they're going to be baffled by the structure, not because the Mayans who built them are stupid, but because one person is using a very different frame of reference than the other. What is going to be beautiful in the wholesome depiction of a human form in one culture is not going to look the same in another, but that does not mean that one person is stupid and that the other person is intelligent. An example of this that I'll give is when we look at Egyptian tomb paintings, the canonized religious depiction of the human form required that all 10 fingers and all 10 toes be shown. So every hand was shown in profile with a very awkward stance, so you'd see all 10 fingers. And every foot was in profile, so you could see in a very awkward stance all 10 toes. The chest is a triangle, and the eyes are shown in profile, or the face is always shown in profile, and the eye is shown in this odd abstract mixture of both profile and frontal perspective. But if you go to different areas of the tomb that is painted that is not supposed to be part of the religious cartouche or the religious narrative, you will see rather photorealistically rendered people in perfect perspective that we're familiar with today. One of the famous ones I remember is it's titled "Girls at the Edge of the Nile," and it's these three girls playing with two ducks at the edge of a Nile, and they're all in different poses, but they're all very realistically rendered, and you can see, they're in beautiful perspective. They're not in this distorted oddity that the religious canonization required. And you can see that at other points of time. One of the famous sculptures is called The Scribe, where it is a very realistically rendered life-size sculpture of an average Joe who was a scribe in their life. It's not that odd kind of distorted Sphinx-like sculpture. And so to say that the Egyptians were stupid and that they didn't know how to render the human form because you only see primarily these cartouche forms is completely inappropriate. So it's something to think about. So yeah, if you have any other questions, then I ask your opinion. Look at this image, blow it up, and then talk about your opinion about how the texture and the form and the gesture impact you emotionally. So you're going to be using a little bit of your 4 tools of artistic critique for your opinion on that. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Whitley, do you have any questions? Or are there
No,
any?
I think you explained it all very well.
Okay, all right. And again, I wanted to stress people who turn in the critiques early will get extra credit. And then I can show those as examples for everybody. Well, excellent. I hope that's everything that I wanted to cover today. And Whitley, do you have any questions about anything else in the class?
No.
Okay, excellent. All right then. Well, that'll be good. That'll be our meeting for today.
Okay.
If anyone does have questions, email me later on. But I'm looking forward to see what people do with the tiles and the colors. So, all right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye. It's my teacher.